Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you guys back to GMHC. We're going to continue our live series, The T, Conversations about Sex, Health, and Pleasure. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Steven Gill. I'm a Brooklynite, and I work as a group facilitator here at GMHC. This is Brian.
Hi everyone, this is Brian Romero. I use he, him, his. I'm a mental health counselor in the mental health services department of GMHC.
Victor.
Hi everybody, I'm Victor Hogue, Director of Support Services at Ryan Health.
Okay, so today we're going to continue with the topic of shame, which if you've been following our series, we started to unpack with my colleague Chris in the last episode. They talked a little bit about shame, mental health, and substance use and how they interacted. So today I wanted to dig a little deeper into that and see how it relates to each other, as well as, particularly to sexual health, especially for LGBT of color. So, initially I would think that if we were talking about that, the first thing we would do would be a definition of each of them. But I kind of think before we even do that, we should talk about just the fact that having this discussion sometime itself can feel shaming. So I guess we can start there.
Sure. So I like the idea of starting off with the definition of shame, because I think so often we get that concept mixed up, and so I think I like to start off with definitions. But so shame, as I understand it from the mental health perspective, is very different from guilt or humiliation or embarrassment, which are levels of feelings. But whereas with guilt, well, let me do embarrassment. So embarrassment is I didn't get to get a haircut before we had this thing. So I'm a little embarrassed about that. But that's, something happened, no big deal, it's a mistake, whatever, happens. Like I tell my nephew, accidents happen. But shame is much more deeper than that. Shame is this idea that I am wrong, right? Part of me, who I am, is intrinsically wrong. And that's very different from that one thing I did over there is a mistake or a boo-boo or bad, right? And so shame, it's really important to the idea of sexual health and mental health, because I would argue it's the most negative emotion that we can experience, and it impacts the rest of those factors.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I also think, to add on to the definition of shame, I believe that it's not even trying to understand somebody else's point of view. So if somebody tells you the definition of something or lets you in on a secret about anything, and you just automatically shame them, you're not even trying to get to know that person. You're not even trying to see that side of the story or what they're going through or their life story.
So being that y'all broke down that what shame means, how does this affect your ability to look at your self-worth, and also how does that affect your ability to take care of yourself?
That's deep.
So it's two questions. So how does that affect the way you see yourself, and then how does it affect your mental health?
Well, your sense of worth, and then how that affects your ability to take care of yourself.
Sure. So I would say,
we could start with one. We could just say, let's start with how it affects your sense of worth.
Sure. So going back to the definition of shame being I am wrong, or I'm intrinsically wrong, right, from the get, that would certainly affect particularly LGBTQ youth of color's idea of their own self-worth. If I think as an LGBTQ youth that I am wrong, right, and regardless of whether that is as a result of my race or my sexual orientation or gender expression or gender identity, it's going to impact the way that I see myself and the way that I think others see me as I walk and just live and am in the world. And so it automatically starts to be a part of everything that I do, the way that I feel, the way I express myself, the way I relate to others, or if I don't relate to them, the choices that I make, and just what I allow to be in my own life.
You're taking all my answers.
Swing your man.
Yeah, just to add on to it. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if he took your answer, you could jump on the second part to how that would relate to your being able to take care of yourself.
Take care of yourself. So I think just growing up in general as a person, LGBTQ person of color, you're already faced with a lot of obstacles just being born into the world. So I think if you don't really have anybody to look up to, and if you don't already have that self-confidence going in, then of course you're not going to have any type of self-worth, or you're not going to be able to go out to, especially in New York City. You're not going to be able to go out into the world and just care for yourself in general.
And so I guess now we'll talk about, if you can't care for yourself, well, how would you be able to negotiate like sexual situations?
Yeah.
It plays all into it. So
yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first of all, I think that if you grew up in an environment where you feel a lot of shame, you start to really internalize that. And again, it really impacts the way that you identify. So as a sexual being, sexuality may be something that's completely closed off to you, right? So it's different for individuals who are cisgender or white, male identified. You know, society sort of says it's okay for you to express yourself however you want, right? Sexuality is celebrated if you're part of identities that are much more protected and represented in society. Whereas if you're more in those oppressed and marginalized communities, I think that there's a way in which you can't even start to have that dialogue with yourself. So you grow up not knowing, how do I identify, right? And even if you do know that, you can't really express that. You can't really celebrate that. You can't even sort of think about it because you're too busy fending off all these messages about who you're supposed to be as opposed to who you are.
Well, as you say that, so in the first part of the series that we had, when they asked the question, one of the responses to how do you think shame makes you feel, somebody responded with distressed, embarrassed, alone, foolish. So like if you're feeling alone, you're right, you wouldn't be able to have conversations with people because you don't even believe there's anyone to have a conversation with, I would assume.
So if somebody shames you, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to do that same thing that got you shamed in the first place. So if you're, coming out to somebody or if you're telling this person a secret, you're not going to do it again because you don't want to feel that same feeling.
Right.
So I guess the next thing we'd like to talk about would be substance abuse. And where should we begin with substance abuse? I guess we'll start with what are the root causes of substance use?
Stress.
Yeah.
Not having another outlet to look to.
I mean, I deeply believe that substance use, I think part of the reason why it still continues is because we think about it as this individual issue, right? There's and I hate using these terms, but I think it's important for this conversation. There are the addicts and sort of crackheads and such that are sort of over there as if substance use is only like an individual issue, but we know that it's also tied to societal issues, right? Racism, oppression completely impact, again, the way that people grow to see themselves. And if society says that if you're a black or brown person or LGBTQ, that your life does not matter, then you're going to internalize that message. You may unconsciously believe, my life doesn't matter. Why would I not use substances, right? Why would I treat my body as a temple if the world doesn't see me as the beautiful individual that I am? And so I do think often that part of why this problem continues is because we're not talking about it from a systems perspective. And so why do people use substances? Because they're trying to cope, because they're trying to deal with the stress of what it means to be a black, brown person, to be LGBTQ, and to live in a society that doesn't see you as worthwhile. And so sometimes that means using just, it's not the most productive way to manage, but I think we need to have more conversations about why are people using as opposed to it just being wrong.
Yeah, and it's easily accessible. Like if I'm going through something or if I'm having these weird feelings, then I can easily get whatever my drug of choice is to just cope with those feelings at the time.
And so how do you guys think shame and trauma are associated to the drug use? Like when you feel shame because I think there's two different ways, not just talking about people who have drug use, but also the fact that people who feel shame and trauma also revert to drug use. So you can't talk about it and it may be where you're running to. I guess.
Yeah. I think, again, going back to the issue of growing up in marginalized and oppressed communities, we're much more likely to experience trauma than other communities. And so, there's a great study called the ACEs study, which looks at trauma in childhood, and there are about 10 trauma types, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, etc., incarceration of a parent. And so the more of those trauma types someone experiences, the more likely they are to have like bad health outcomes, right? So the more trauma one experiences, the more likely they are to engage in substance use and have poor mental health, period, and sexual health, to the point that you mentioned before. So I guess the way I see it is there's the trauma that happens, which is compounded by being a part of oppressed communities. Mm-hmm. There's the shame about having been through the trauma, and then also the shame of being part of communities that are oppressed. And then that leads to substance use, poor mental health, and poor ability to even cope with mental health burden.
So I would believe that you then, that you do believe that substance use then is a problem in LGBT communities of color.
Yeah, hands down.
Yeah, I mean, we're vastly, at more risk of using substances in other communities, and process addictions as well. I mean, sexual addiction, porn addiction. I don't know about shopping, because sometimes, we don't really have any money like that. But
they have the money for that.
Right. But certainly, I think across the spectrum of addictions and substance use, yes, we're much more greater likelihood to be at risk of that.
And do you kind of relate that back to the trauma that we go through?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think going back to the point of addictions being this way of coping with negative feelings, right? Again, so if it's the trauma happened, I don't know, maybe it's more useful to think of a client example, and I won't use any identifying information. But I think of a client who experienced having a father who is a brown person and is a gay man, and as a child experienced a father who was very violent, unfortunately, and grew up and suffered from addiction and substance use as a way to cope with those feelings. And so I do think it's like firmly rooted in that, because again, if society doesn't celebrate you, if at home you weren't celebrated, then you're going to turn to something to try to ease the pain.
So what do you think, like, specifically about, like, for how this relates to, like, the susceptibility of HIV infection? Like, how does this, like, because we want to make sure that everyone can understand, like, how these things, like, put them at risk. Like, how exactly does feeling shame put someone at risk for HIV infection who is a member of the LGBT community?
So I would say, kind of like piggyback what off you said in the beginning, just going off the definition of shame, and when you see what people go through in their lives, that could easily lead to lowering your self-confidence and lowering your self-worth. So if you're using certain substances, definitely that puts you at risk of HIV infection, just because you're not in your right mind most of the time when it comes down to, you getting ready to have sex. Or even if the person you're having sex with, they may be the person supplying you with the substance of use, so they know how it can affect you in different ways. I think it kind of varies.
Yeah, and I do think, during the height of the AIDS epidemic, there was what mental health practitioners call the perfect storm, which was, it was kind of during towards the end of the sexual revolution, and then you had meth and gay men made this perfect storm of gay men who felt deep shame about who they are, right? Who then used meth as a way to manage, again, that shame, which made them more susceptible to contracting HIV or AIDS. So it really was this perfect storm. And even today, I think there's this issue about sexual practices among gay men, right? There's been a lot of pushback, I think, against PrEP as a sort of like impulsive behavior. But I mean, I'm going to be very honest.
Well, it's because you're promiscuous. That's why you need it, right?
Right. But what's wrong with wanting to physically, sexually connect with others the way that other communities have been allowed to and endorsed to do so?
Without the shame.
Right. And so why not? But I do think that sometimes because we're told, no, you can't, right? No, you're bad, then, there's a lot of substance use that happens in tandem with sex.
Well, yeah, and then you're not allowed to talk about it, so you're not discussing it with your providers, with your friends, so you're not actually finding tips or ways that you can actually help yourself or go about it in a better manner. You're just like blindly going into the abyss and taking chances and just hoping that things are working out. Now, how does this affect like your ability to like get and seek care, like specifically like talk like mental health care or talking to your doctor when you have a lot of shame or associated with like substance abuse or mental health as an LGBT person?
So I mean, I can use, I guess, me for an example. Just growing up in the South as an LGBTQ person, you don't go to see any type of mental health services. You go to church. So that's the thing. That's big within I would say, for example, for the Black community, you don't go to talk to this person about your business, or you don't go to the doctor to talk to this person. You go to church, you pray it off, and you keep it pushing. But in the same sense, that's suppressing what's actually going on. Like, you can go to church, you can pray all day, but at the end of the day, those problems are still going to be there. So I mean, go ahead. No, so I think it's good to find an outlet to talk to somebody. It's easy to go find a person, whether it's your doctor, whether it's a close friend, whether it's a psychiatrist, whoever. Find somebody close to, just to use as an outlet to let it go, let it out.
Yeah, I think also in Latinx communities, we're not very well known for accessing healthcare services. I think part of that also is language, though, because obviously in this country we always prioritize English. But I think Latinx communities struggle a lot with accessing healthcare, maintaining their healthcare. Sometimes even if they're able to get in the door, the retention of particularly communities of color in healthcare is very poor, right? So as, for example, maybe we could track white communities and how they do their 2 checkups every year. That's far less for communities of color. And for trans communities, I mean, there's so much violence that happens, even in healthcare systems, even in the mental health care system, against trans and gender nonconforming communities, where even getting to the door takes way too much energy. So access and retention, but outcomes are also poor.
Yeah, and even, I mean, just look at communities of colors. When you have in a specific area, you may see a hospital or a clinic, but 9 times out of 10, you don't want to go to that particular place because you're going to know somebody in there that works there. So I don't want to go to this random organization that's 2 blocks from my house because I know Ray works there, and I don't want my business to get out in the streets. So I mean, that's definitely a factor too.
If you guys are just joining us, we're here at GMHC talking about HIV stigma and how it relates to mental health and substance use. This is the T. I'm Steven Gill. I'm with Brian Romero and Victor Hogue to help us further understand this topic. You can join the discussion by commenting on the bottom below. So I guess next what we want to talk about is what resources are there available to people in New York City that they can use if they have substance use problems or, well, issues, especially for LGBTQ of color. I know here at GMHC we have the mental health department, Article 31, Article 32. I don't know if you want to go a little more detail about that.
So, I mean, I feel like the Article 31 and 32 means nothing to people sometimes. Frankly, sometimes I'm like, what? We do have a mental health clinic. We do have a substance use clinic. Unfortunately, they're sort of split up, but we have practitioners in both that can address both issues. So those are certainly resources. We don't really see, I think, youth in our outpatient mental health clinic, even though we can. So this is a strong sort of call in for youth to come and attend our clinic. I think would be wonderful. And yeah, certainly our substance use clinic as well. We have a lot of groups. We have psychiatry. We're a pretty good group.
Yeah. Same thing with Ryan Health. You can go to ryanhealth.org. We have mental health services, case management. for both that are actively positive and negative. So just depending on your situation, we can alter it and send you to whoever.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are other resources. There, I think it's the Comptroller's Office has an LGBTQ resources guide, which is really good. So if people Google LGBTQ resources guide New York City, it should pop up.
Okay, the next question. How does the online experience of LGBTQ of color impact their mental health well-being, particularly about bullying and discrimination based off sexual gender and identity? That's a big one.
That was.
Yeah.
That was loaded.
Yeah.
You want to take it first?
Sure. I mean, I think there has been, unfortunately, a huge rise of bullying, just kind of across the board.
Mm-hmm.
But really, as with any other issue, we know that bullying impacts LGBTQ youth by far a lot. Particularly, again, if you're LGBTQ youth and people of color, right? So
Yeah.
that intersectional issue. Cyberbullying is a major issue. There's a lot of bullying that happens on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat, even though I'm not on Snapchat. But that happens a lot. And but I would say even this idea, you know, I think a lot of youth will go on like IG or something else and start to see bodies again that are celebrated so much more than theirs. Not that they're more beautiful, not that they're worth more, but they'll see peers who are white identified, cis identified, sort of blonde and blue-eyed, and not that that's a bad thing, but seeing that as being the standard of beauty that's celebrated in our society over and over and over again can have a detrimental impact on mental health. And we've started to study how social media and exposure amongst youth to social media does facilitate a negative self-image. And so it's kind of hard because we live in that society, but I think at least if we started to shift the narrative of what beauty is, then maybe there would not be as much.
Yeah, same situation. I think that whenever you're going on social media, whether it's IG, Facebook, whatever, and you're seeing these comments or you're seeing these pictures that don't necessarily look like you or don't necessarily relate back to you. And even if you, let's say if you post a picture and people are commenting, they might not necessarily think they're bullying you or something negative, but it all goes back to that particular person that posted the photo. Right. You know, maybe I feel a certain type of way about you saying this in this comment, so that's going to make me feel a certain type of way about it. So it kind of varies. It depends.
Well, and then you have like people seeing people living their best lives and then comparing it to what their image of their life is looking like, and they're like, wow, I'm not doing any of this. Like, everyone's living these amazing lives. They look like this, they're getting this attention, like, what do I have to look forward to? And then they try to create this image of them being that, and sometimes they don't match up to what they really see, and then so, you know, that's only complicating it.
Especially when more followers equals, like, more, when that's just not
more likes,
the case.
More comments.
Right, more likes, more comments, more followers. It's just not the case.
It's all about the hype. It's overrated, I think.
Yeah.
That's something, talking about online experience. There's a generation of younger people whose experience is solely, like, especially sexual experience, is based online. That's the only thing they know. They have not been taught otherwise.
Yeah.
Of intimacy. I just wanted your opinions, your ideas about how we can navigate that. Because
Sure. So I think we're talking about, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but Grindr, right?
Oh,
Jack,
okay,
the hookup apps, Tinder, right? Online dating is a whole other world of its
Also,
own.
but porn too, I think. Not just the online dating aspect, but like their entire idea of sex and gender is everything they've seen online. So also the masculinity, like the way females are supposed to look, it's all completely created from what they see online.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think even like the idea of what the best porns are, right, are usually, again, the beauty standards, like muscular folks, tall folks, light-skinned folks, cis folks. But also, like, on online dating, there's been a lot of trends of, like, no femmes, no trans, no any of these things, which is really isolating and very detrimental to our mental health. And that's been a huge trend. And it's not, I think we saw recently that I think it was Grindr that was tracking also HIV status, which is such a violation, and also, again, really sends a very negative message for those who live with HIV or AIDS.
Yeah, and even some of the other apps, I know people, you know, they put it in their entire bio. I don't want anybody that's positive or negative only or negative as of such and such, such and such. And for me, I just feel like, what does that even mean? Like, you're telling me that you're negative as of October 2017. Okay, and I don't know that. Like, how am I supposed to know that? Even if somebody, you know, I like to see the profiles that people are upfront with it. I'm HIV positive, undetectable, I've been this way since whatever. This is what it is. Put everything out in the open. Just keep it moving.
Yeah.
Well,
but also, like, why do we live in a society that says, like, I need to know your status? I guess I can understand that, but I also, maybe I come from a more radical stance of, like, so what, right? We do have resources now that weren't available before. PrEP, right? PEP, we could still use condoms, right? Those things are still available to us, that even if we're a sort of serodiscordant couple, right? Even if I'm negative and you're positive, like, I guess I can understand it, but at the same time I push back against it. For the same reason that I think about my clients who are constantly talking about, like, well, I can't even date again because I have to disclose. I have to negotiate that. I have to talk about that. And it becomes this whole thing. And then before we know it, it's been years before they've even, you know, I've had clients who haven't kissed people, had sex with them, gone on a date in years. It's incredibly sad to know.
Well, yeah, I mean, it comes from where that shame that initially came, and also a lack of education that, you know, other people have. Like, they don't understand that we have PrEP, we have PEP, then we have other things you can have. You can use condoms, you can use protection, you don't have to have just regular sex. There are other things that you can do to experience and show love to people, but because of those two things working together, we're getting in situations like you're saying over there. I think we have another question.
So yeah, talking about the youth and its relation to social media apps and their ultimate mental health, a lot of things that we notice as providers that the youth aren't coming into, let's say GMHC, for example, for services. Are there ways do you guys think that we can capitalize on the power of the online social media community to get the youth to receive the services, or at least get information about the services?
Yeah, there's I can't remember his title. I think he's an associate commissioner in the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, DOHMH. His name is Dimitri, and his last name is really long, and I can't pronounce it.
Daskalakis.
Yeah, it's also Greek. I know, it's just like, wait, I don't want to pronounce that wrong. But what he did was really amazing in that he went into bathhouses to do outreach. And I think that when we talk about youth, who, again, for many reasons that we said, right, shame and body image and such, are not going to be our traditional consumers. They're not going to access our services in the same way that other folks have. We really need to start thinking about different, completely, radical approaches to outreach, to getting them in, to helping them access it, to retain the services, and get the word out, right? We really can do things the same as we've done with other populations. We need to start going to wherever it is that they're at, wherever it may be, even if it's bars, even if it's clubs, even if it's warehouses, whatever. I don't even know where the latest party spots are at, but wherever that's at, we need to go, right? Why couldn't we have sort of drop-in mental health counseling in areas like that, right? Part of the reason why suicide is so high amongst teens is it's just not being talked about. And so I think we need to start getting out there as opposed to come to 38th Street and access services. Well, if I'm poor, and again, a person of color and trans, and I've been told that's not for me, why would I even go in the first place?
Yeah, and I think we get so caught in as providers, we get so caught to just be behind our computer and just click and think that's going to solve everything. Yes. So I was talking to a coworker the other day, like that hardcore outreach, it doesn't happen anymore. Like going out 3, 4 a.m. at the club, at the bars, doing hardcore outreach, you don't see it anymore because everybody wants to leave their job at 5, 6 o'clock thinking that HIV is going to stop at 5 or 6 when they leave. It's just not realistic. You can get all these numbers, get all these emails, and send out a blast. But at the end of the day, if these kids don't know who you are and they don't trust you, they're not coming in. Mm-hmm. Just a simple point of they're not coming. Yeah. So like you said, you really got to start thinking about different ways to reach the population as opposed to waiting for them to come to you. It's just not going to happen. You can give a Metro card, you can give a movie ticket, you can give whatever you need to give. But they can go to another agency and get the same thing. So what are you offering different that that they can't get themselves?
Well, they have them stocked up already.
Yeah, they already got them stocked up. Like, they know the game. Come on.
By the way, in addition to what just been shared with you, you can find all this information by clicking on the links below. We're talking about mental health and substance use and how it's related to our efforts to end HIV in New York State by 2020. Any final thoughts, advice that you guys would like to offer?
That's always the hardest question. I think I've become very frustrated, frankly, with the mental health profession and field and industry. Just like I've been frustrated with other aspects of society. And I think because whether it's mental health, whether it's substance use, whether it's HIV or AIDS or et cetera, we need to start thinking about how these issues align with societal issues, right? So how does racism and homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, translate over? How does it impact these issues, right? And if we're not doing the work to reverse that, then I think we're just going to continue to have these conversations over and over.
So why do you think we're not actually going into those topics? Like, why are we avoiding those topics?
I think as a society, we're trained to not talk about race. We're trained to not talk about oppression. Even like I think about even in our professional programs as social workers, as doctors, as nurse practitioners, as sort of any kind of profession, we're not taught that language. We're taught this person has this problem, it's their fault. Again, we do such a great job at like perpetuating that shame, right? It's all about that person and that individual as opposed to like, well, how did they even get there, right? So like the other day I was having this conversation about, because someone asked me the same thing, why do people continue to have mental health issues? And I told them, a mentor of mine explained it to me as, it's like if you ever seen like crabs in a barrel, you know, they're kind of like, they're just climbing over each other. It's like to get to the top, right? And they're climbing over each other, they're climbing over each other. Oppressed communities, marginalized communities are climbing over each other to access resources and services and programs. But we never stop to think about why we're even in the barrel in the first place. And that barrel is the systems that keep us in place, that keep us fighting with each other to access those services. So I think if we start sort of taking a step back and looking at the barrel and why we even suffer from mental health issues, substance use issues, et cetera, then we'll start to get to the root of the issue.
Yeah, I think it's a lot to do with a lot of hard work that you don't necessarily know where the outcome is going to go. And so there's a little bit of a fear of like, how much work are we going to have to put in to actually get through it, not realizing that by not putting any work, it's just continually going to be something that we're going to continue to deal with.
Right.
Yeah?
I'll make it quick. Final thoughts. So I would say that at the root, question?
For your final thought, I have a question, I don't know, something to think about. It's more of the mental health professions and how they integrate people's cultural experiences and expressions into their practice. Like you mentioned, church. Some people, the church is the way to go. Like how can we get societies? How can we get people to meet halfway? Because my sense of healing is different from another person's. Where's the opportunity there?
For sure. I mean, I think, again, like in the social work realm, in the mental health field, we talk about cultural competency. That's another point of frustration for me, because it's like, for me, that feels like, well, if I just eat your foods, right, and I listen to whatever, bachata or salsa, then all of a sudden I know what your culture is about. And that's just not the case, right? Like, again, my family came from Colombia, right? I'm Colombian American, but that doesn't mean that I know all Latin cultures, right? Even in South America, there are indigenous tribes that don't speak Spanish, right? They'll speak whatever language is aboriginal to them, right? It's their root. And so again, even in even in cultures, we need to be having the conversations about like what is wellness in your culture, right? Not in the Latino culture, but in your culture, in Guatemala, maybe in the indigenous tribe that your family is from, right? Or in whatever, Colombia, in like Cartagena, or wherever you're from, right? So not assuming that we can just get it just by picking up a book, you know, Latino mental health or whatever, as if, you know, we're not a monolithic community. So, but also understanding how, like, one example is like, here we're talking about anxiety. So someone comes in, if they're like Latino, we'll say, hey, they have an anxiety disorder, that's what it is, right? Or they have like trauma. When like places like Puerto Rico, it's called ataque de nervios, so it's very different. It's more like nerves as opposed to like this like more strong sense of anxiety. So even the way we think about mental health is completely influenced by American culture and frankly colonization.
So I also think that part of something that we don't like is people stepping up. Like I know in the earlier discussion that was had, there was like one comment that was made that's like people have to like own some of their like stuff, and like the fact that like we don't have more representation of people with substance use problems and people with mental health problems who we can look for as role models or who are like, hey, I'm dealing with this. And, you know, so you think you're in it by yourself, even though everyone else is in it. And so it's like, it continues to perpetuate the problem because you're just like going through it by yourself, not realizing that these people that you think have the grandest life actually are going through it and managing it. And if it were a little more, you know, out there for everyone to see, then potentially you would be able to go through your everydays a little bit easier because you're like, you know what? They're dealing with the same stuff I am, and they're still like, you know, out there smiling, out there living a good life and putting out that image. So I think that's something also that should be considered. We need to like, not just address our own issues, but after or while addressing our issues, be candid enough to talk to the people while we're doing it. So that way, you know, other people can understand where you are and also like can, you know, take some type of something home for themselves from it.
Yeah. I agree.
So I think that kind of to piggyback what off you said, it all relates back to stigma and shame. Like if somebody is popular and they're going through the same thing and they haven't, you know, come out and said that they're going through it, it goes back to stigma and shame. I don't know if I can say the title of what I'm about to say on camera, but I just finished watching this series with some friends that, you know, put the light on the house and ball community, which was amazing. And we've never seen that on like national television. But at the same time, after watching that, they still had that same stigma and shame in their head just because it focused on what happened back in the 80s and the 70s, which is good because it should tell that story. But what do we have now? We have PrEP, we have PEP, we have treatment as prevention, you because you, and none of that has been mentioned. It may happen in the next couple seasons, but we can't put certain stuff out there, and then want to say, well, I don't want to. We need to get rid of stigma and shame. It just aired on TV for the last 2 months, and it's still being perpetuated in our community. So like, what can we do as providers to help, you know, get rid of all this? And so for me, watching it with friends, I'm just like, you know, that was the case then, and I'm glad you guys are seeing the story that's been told. But at the same time, this is what is available now.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Yeah, I do think we also need more of a peer-led movement in mental health and substance use. You know, there's another friend says that he's a friend sort of who's in this criminal justice reform movement who says the people closest to the problems are the ones closest to the solutions. And I do firmly believe that if you're someone who's been impacted by mental health issues, substance use issues, etc., you've been there, you know it, in this way that a degree will never be able to tell you or show you, right? No matter how good the training is. So I do think, and there's been a movement to have more of a peer recovery model and have more individuals trained in that. But I think we need more. And I think we need individuals who are in leadership who understand that. And I think, for example, like the speaker of the New York City Council, Corey Johnson, is somebody who talks about living with addiction issues and who also lives with HIV or AIDS. That's really powerful, to have someone in leadership who's willing to tell that story and say that that's a part of their narrative. And their leadership is really helpful to our communities. But we need more people in leadership, in government agencies and such who are willing to share that story and take the lead.
Yeah, because even just what you said, I totally agree with it. And I think Corey Johnson, he's an amazing individual. But just thinking about most of the kids, he doesn't look like us.
Right.
So just going back to what we've been saying, we need people that need to, step up and put the word out there. Like just, it's like I said, it always goes back to stigma and shame. It all falls back on stigma and shame. So.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you guys. I think we've done a good job here today. We're gonna wrap up, but once again, you can click any of the links below, and you can continue to leave us messages. And at the next time that we do a filming, we'll try to get back to it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.